Right, well, welcome to Lecture 8, which is our final lecture in our Consciousness and Introspection Summer School. And today is our fourth lecture on, which is a sort of focus on lecture. Today's lecture is on a paper by Martine Nida-Rümelin called The Illusion of Illusionism. And it's about illusionism, as you can probably tell. But let me begin by recapping. So you remember last time I was exploring the idea that introspection is a representational system. And I suggested that if any representational system is going to open up the possibility of ignorance and error, and moreover, any representational system will have certain built-in limitations. It will represent certain target properties and not others. It'll represent the distribution of some of the target properties and not other distributions. And it'll represent certain things about the nature of the target properties, but not other things about the nature of the target properties. And what I was suggesting was that, well, if we think of introspection as a kind of representational system, then we would expect versions of those properties to apply there as well, though perhaps different theories might represent them in different ways. And so I think it turned out. So what I did in particular is I looked at three areas in the philosophy of introspection to see how those properties might play out in different ways. One was this idea that there's no appearance and reality distinction in introspection. One was there was the discussion of luminosity, and in particular Williamson's anti-luminosity argument. And the final one was the discussion of illusionism. And we saw that introspection does indeed have these properties, but perhaps in slightly different forms depending on your theory. Like, for example, in the discussion of appearance, the denial of an appearance and reality distinction, if you really denied that distinction, then presumably you would reject any kind of ignorance and error possibility in the case of introspection. But as we saw, even acquaintance theories will agree that it's perfectly possible to be in a conscious state and not believe that you are, and likewise it's perfectly possible to believe that you're in it and not be in it. It is true, as we noted, that an acquaintance theory will entail that if you're in a state, then you have a certain kind of justification to believe that you're in a state, and the reverse as well, whereas that isn't true on the rationalist view. So there's a sort of difference on those views in how they understand this idea about appearance and reality. In the case of the Williamson's anti-luminosity argument, I looked very briefly at some responses to that argument, but I really only concentrated on one, which was the idea that we could define a closely related notion, which I called ceteris paribus luminosity, which says that it's not true for every situation in which you're in a state that you're in a position to know it, only that it's true of every situation in which you're in a state you're in a position to know it, other things being equal. And the general point was that a rationalist view can exploit that distinction in thinking about Williamson's argument. And the moral from that was, or at least one moral was, that shows that there's a sort of limitation on the distribution of conscious states that the system can represent, given the conclusion of the anti-luminosity argument. And then finally, in the discussion of illusionism, we noted that it's plausible that in introspection you can represent properties like being in pain. It's much less plausible that you can represent much more theory-laden properties like being acquainted with a sense datum or being in a state that satisfies the principle of revelation. And if that's true, then there's a problem for illusionism, because illusionism wants to say that there's a single property which you represent to be instantiated in introspection, which isn't instantiated and which plays a crucial role in the mind-body problem. But the difficulty for a position like that is to identify such a property. And while we can find properties that satisfy some of those conditions, it's difficult to find any property that satisfies all. Okay, well, what I want to do in this final lecture is to focus on a paper, as I mentioned, by Martine Nida-Rümelin, which concentrates directly on this last issue, but I think makes a very interesting point about illusionism that's distinct from any that we've looked at so far. Okay, so who, first of all, is Martine Nida-Rümelin? Well, here she is in a seminar. She is a professor of philosophy at Freiburg University, and she's really written some terrific papers on philosophy of mind. She's perhaps most famous for the so-called Nida-Rümelin room, which is a room named by John Perry, the philosopher at Stanford, after her. And the Nida-Rümelin room is a sort of, what's the word, an antechamber or something in the Jackson-Mary thought experiment. The idea is that we know that the experiment, Mary's in her black and white room, and then she comes out and sees a red thing, and the question is, does she learn what it's like to see a red thing or not? The Nida-Rümelin room is a kind of halfway house. She comes out and she's presented with a red thing, but she doesn't have the relevant conceptual capacities in a certain way. And Nida-Rümelin uses this room to illustrate certain points about what you might think of as Mary's epistemic progress from ignorance to knowledge on the question of knowing what it's like to see a red thing. So look that up if you're interested in that aspect of the discussion. Today's paper isn't really to do with that topic. It's to do with illusionism. And here is how the paper begins. According to illusionism, she says, about phenomenal consciousness, no living being is ever phenomenally conscious. This claim strikes many people as absurd, and that reaction is perfectly adequate. There is so much to do in philosophy in search of the truth that one should not lose too much time with absurd theories. But Keith Frankish's defense of illusionism goes wrong in an interesting and illuminating manner. It therefore undoubtedly deserves being seriously discussed. Now, of course, Frankish's defense of illusionism that she's referring to is Frankish's well-known paper on illusionism as a theory of consciousness. And this paper by Nida-Rümelin is one of the many commentaries on that paper. But I think it's one of the rather more interesting ones, partly because it's a very clear statement of themes that occur in other parts of her work. It's just a particularly succinct, I think, statement of some of these views, and she brings it to bear on this illusionism question in an interesting way. Notice that she thinks that it's not worth discussing whether illusionism is true. Of course it's not true, but it is worth discussing why it goes wrong, and that's the thing that she feels that she can make a contribution to. We'll come back later to this issue about the absurdity of illusionism. Well, what is the key distinction that Nida-Rümelin makes? Well, the key distinction in this paper is between what she calls experiential and phenomenal properties. The labels here are always a bit hard to keep track of because words like experiential, phenomenal, qualitative, and so on are often just used interchangeably, and nobody notices what it is that we're talking about or how they're different from each other. One thing I think is very good in Nida-Rümelin's work is the sort of sensitivity to these distinctions and how there are lots of different properties here which people tend to mush together. And in this particular case, there's a distinction between, as I said, experiential properties, as she calls them, and phenomenal properties. And we can think of these, we can think about the difference here, I think, by thinking about how they would play out in contrasting definitions of being phenomenally conscious. So let's take the first one. Here on this slide, we've got two definitions of phenomenal consciousness. And if we look at these definitions, that'll help us to introduce this distinction between experiential and phenomenal properties. So the first definition says, to be phenomenally conscious is to instantiate an experiential property. Now, here the notion of being phenomenally conscious, what Nida-Rümelin has in mind is a property of a subject, like an animal or a person, something like that. A person is phenomenally conscious. In some parts of the literature on consciousness, people use the notion of phenomenally conscious to apply to states of people, states that people might be in, but not to people themselves. That's not what Nida-Rümelin is talking about here. She's talking about a property of a person or a subject or an animal, namely for such a subject to be phenomenally conscious is for that subject to instantiate an experiential property. Now that way of introducing the notion of an experiential property immediately makes it clear that experiential properties are themselves properties of subjects or individuals, just as on this way of understanding phenomenal consciousness, it's a property of a subject or an individual. So in that sense, it's logically like, being an accountant or being an Australian or something. These are properties, if anything has those properties, then it's subjects or individuals that have those properties, not anything else. So what is and the same could be said on this view about experiential properties. There's properties of subjects. Well, what are experiential properties? Well, in effect, they're the properties of the kind that we've been looking at all along. It's like, to feel a pain in your foot would be one kind of experiential property, or perceiving a red thing, or imagining an elephant flying over a blue lake, to use an example that she herself uses. So the idea is that these are properties that are had by subjects or individuals. It's subjects who perceive red things or feel pain in their feet or imagine elephants flying over blue lakes. And the definition of phenomenal consciousness here is that you are phenomenally conscious just in case you instantiate one or other of those properties, or perhaps usually a massive complex or many such properties. But at least it's sufficient that if you, for example, perceive a red thing, then you're phenomenally conscious according to this view. So that's one definition of phenomenal consciousness, and it's one way of thinking about experiential properties. They're properties had by subjects, and they're properties like, feeling pain in your feet, imagining an elephant, and so forth. Well, there's a contrasting definition, which is to be phenomenally conscious is to have experiences which themselves instantiate phenomenal properties. Now, the idea here is that, again, we're thinking of being phenomenally conscious as a property of a subject, but the definition is that to be that way, to be phenomenally conscious, what this definition says is that you must have experiences which themselves instantiate some properties. So you must bear some relation to something which itself instantiates a property. So it's a bit like bearing a relation to, it's like having a marble in your pocket. It's like when you have a marble in your pocket, you bear a relation to a thing, a marble, which is in your pocket, and it has certain properties. Maybe it has a certain shape or color or size, something like that. Now, what are these things that you bear relations to on this second definition? Well, these things are called experiences, or maybe there's an experience. And what are these? Well, in Nida-Rümelin's view, these are events, where events are distinct, are not subjects or individuals. Events are things like, birthday parties or funerals or elections or, political revolutions or something of that kind. These are events. We can also think of events of a more boring sort, like my raising my arm is an event too. They're sort of happenings or occurrences, or perhaps there are various ways of understanding these notions, but that's an initial way to think about them. And the properties of this, events of this kind themselves have properties, of course, like take a birthday party. That's an event. Well, what would be a property of such a thing? Well, maybe it's, lasting the whole afternoon. That's a property of a birthday party. It might last the whole afternoon. And notice that isn't a property of a subject. We wouldn't normally say of some subject, like an accountant, that it lasts the whole afternoon. That doesn't really make any sense. So this is a property of an experience. And here the notion of a phenomenal property that Nida-Rümelin wants us to focus on is a property of an experience, namely of an event, not a property of a subject. So that's the crucial point. Phenomenal properties are properties of events, namely experiences, which people have. We have an experience, and then phenomenal properties are properties of those things that we have, and these are events. What is it to have an event? Well, that's a difficult question, but you might think of it as being the agent of the event. So if I raise my arm, there's an event of a raising of an arm, and I am the agent of that event. And then there are certain properties of that event, for example, that it took place in Canberra, and the phenomenal properties here are thought of as like that. They're properties of events that happen, that we bear relations to. So phenomenal properties are clearly different from experiential properties, since they attach to completely different things. Experiential properties attach to subjects, phenomenal properties attach to events, even though both are involved in a definition of phenomenal consciousness. So that's the distinction between experiential and phenomenal properties. One further thing, what is an example of a phenomenal property? In the case of an experiential property, it's relatively easy to give examples. You know, an experiential property is like having a pain in your foot, imagining an elephant, perceiving a red thing. These are experiential properties. In the case of phenomenal properties, it's much harder. It is not that hard to come up with properties of events lasting the whole afternoon. That's a property of an event. But it's much harder to come up with examples of what a phenomenal property is. And that will turn out to be part of the point that Nida-Rümelin is trying to make. Okay, so with this distinction in hand, what is her objection to illusionism? Well, the objection is really a dilemma, I think. It's the idea is that illusionism can be interpreted either as a thesis about phenomenal properties, that is, properties of events, or as a thesis about experiential properties, that is, properties of subjects. And the idea, her suggestion is, either way is trouble. Suppose first that it's a thesis about phenomenal properties, properties of events. Then I think she wants to say that the distinctive claims about introspection that the illusionist makes are false. In other words, it's not true that we believe in introspection that experiences have phenomenal properties. It's just not true. And the reason is roughly that it's a complete confusion. The whole notion of a phenomenal property is, from her point of view, a complete confusion. So it's not true that we believe in introspection, that experiences have these phenomenal properties. It's a confusion to interpret introspection as telling a story of that kind about ourselves. What about if we operate with experiential properties, namely properties of subjects? Then it might be plausible to say that we believe in introspection, that we instantiate experiential properties, but the claim that those beliefs are false, which is crucial to the illusionist, won't be true. So the distinctive claim about consciousness won't be true. And the reason is that, according to Nida-Rümelin, we do in fact instantiate experiential properties. We do in fact perceive red things, feel pain in the feet, and so forth. And so if you interpret it as a claim about experiential properties, then it isn't true either. I think it's not quite right to say that Nida-Rümelin simply has an objection to illusionism. She also wants to sort of diagnose why someone might be committed to illusionism. And the thought is that that illusionists are committed to illusionism because they are in the grip of this picture about experiences, in the grip of the picture that experiences are events which have these things called phenomenal properties, and that it's fine to say that there aren't any, that they do not in fact instantiate phenomenal properties. That's the idea, but that's a kind of confused picture from her point of view. It's a confused way of thinking about experiences or about consciousness. Really, we should think of consciousness as just a matter of instantiating experiential properties or not. Now, a sort of distinctive feature of Nida-Rümelin's paper is that she doesn't just say that illusionists are in the grip of this mistaken view about experiences. She thinks that non-illusionists, realists, are also in the grip. And so she thinks, in fact, it's a very widespread way of thinking about experiences, and it's a mistaken way. And actually some evidence in favour of this suggestion that that it's a very widespread way of thinking about consciousness and experience. I think, isn't that, we don't need to look that far to find such evidence. If we just look back at some passages from the Lewis paper about the identification hypothesis that we looked at before, we can find paragraphs that look very much like this idea that experiences are events which have certain phenomenal properties in her terminology, and then sometimes we have this idea of experiential properties as well. So let's look at these two passages from Lewis to try to illustrate this. So Lewis begins his paper by saying, I will say experiences when I mean particular events of experiencing. So here's the idea of an experience as an event, like a birthday party. And that's one of the notions that is involved in the second definition of consciousness that I mentioned. To be conscious is to have an experience with certain properties. So here at least Lewis says that there are these things called experiences, which are events. And then he says, these events are the havings of experiential states which are had repeatedly at different times and by different people. So notice that experiential states here are things that people have. Okay, they're properties of people. Experiential states act very much like properties, and they're properties that are had by people. And so they are rather like, actually, the experiential properties that Nida-Rümelin is talking about. They're things, they're property things that, or property-like things, at any rate, that are had by people, by subjects. And Lewis then goes on to say these repeatable states, a state that's repeatable is effectively a property, are also called experiences, but not in this paper, he says. So he acknowledges that you could call these things these things, which are very much like Nida-Rümelin's experiential properties, you could call them experiences, but not in this paper. For him, experiences are events of experiencing. And so there we have the idea of an event of experiencing, and we also have this idea of an experiential state, which is rather like an experiential property in Nida-Rümelin's sense. But let's look at this other passage, which in fact we've looked at before, where Lewis says, according to the identification thesis, when I have an experience with quale Q, the knowledge I thereby gain reveals the essence of Q. Now, notice here when he says, when I have an experience with quale Q, well, we know what an experience is. It's an event of experiencing. He's just said that to us. And it has a property, namely Q. Well, that is exactly what Nida-Rümelin is talking about when she's talking about phenomenal properties. Notice that Q is a property of the experience. It's not like the experiential state, which is a property of a person. Okay, so Q here, the quale Q, is exactly what Nida-Rümelin is talking about when she's talking about a phenomenal property. It's a property of an experience. But the notion of an experiential state that Lewis also talks about is very much like an experiential property. Now Lewis goes on to say, actually, in the paper, that it might be redundant to talk about both experiential states and about qualia, namely these properties of experience. You may not need to talk about both. And that suggests he thinks that you can go back and forth between them, go back and forth between a conception of experience according to which it involves these special properties of events versus a conception of experience that just involves properties of people, things that are had repeatedly at different times by different people. Well, maybe he's right about that, but the point that Nida-Rümelin is making is that that's a mistake, she thinks. It's a mistake that if you think you can go back and forth without comment, that would be a mistake. So to that extent, if Lewis is saying that, then that would be a mistake in his paper. But Lewis is some sort of realist, or at least some sort of complicated realist, and illusionists present themselves as non-realists. Actually, the distinction between illusionism and Lewis here is a little bit subtle, because Lewis thinks that experiences exist in one sense but not in others, and that's typically the case of the illusionist as well. Okay, so that's the distinction, and then we can see the distinction in Lewis, the distinction, in other words, between experiential properties and phenomenal properties that Nida-Rümelin introduces, and we can see that at least something like this distinction is going on in Lewis, sort of underneath. I think we can also express Nida-Rümelin's objection to illusionism using the format that we considered last time. If you remember that last time I said, well, there's a sort of basic objection to illusionism, which is that according to it, there's a property F which must meet three conditions. First, we must believe by introspection that F is instantiated. Second, it must be true that F isn't instantiated. And third, it must be that F is essential to the mind-body problem. All of these three things are required because the first two are, you need the first two to have an introspective illusion, to believe that by introspection that something is instantiated and yet it isn't. And you need the third thing to make it interesting, effectively, to connect illusionism with the mind-body problem. The whole point of illusionism, in a certain sense, is that it's driven by this kind of sense of despair about the mind-body problem, about how you can't, in fact, fit consciousness into a general, a broadly scientific worldview. I'm much less pessimistic than the illusionist about that, so I'm less motivated by that. But it's certainly true that the illusionist is motivated by that. So that's why they need a property that satisfies all three conditions. But now we could sort of usefully think of Nida-Rümelin's objection as taking this form, because she might say, well, either F is an experiential property, namely a property of subjects, or it's a phenomenal property, namely a property of events, and either way is trouble. So suppose it's an experiential property, then she will say B isn't true. It's not true that F is not instantiated, because that would be the claim that, for example, you don't perceive a red thing, or you don't have a pain in your foot or something. And that is implausible from her point of view, in fact absurd, as she says. Suppose it's a phenomenal property, the property of an event. Well, then I think she will say that both A and C are mistaken. It's not true that we believe by introspection that F is instantiated, because that would be to believe by introspection that some phenomenal property, that there's some phenomenal property which is instantiated by an event, and that she thinks isn't true. And likewise, it's not the case that that's in any way essential to the mind-body problem. In fact, that's a complete confusion from her point of view. So we can express her view, I think, in this using this basic structure. Well, I've been talking about the sort of structure of her objection, namely that, one can distinguish phenomenal properties and experiential properties, and that one can interpret the illusionist as as operating with either notion, and either way leads to trouble. But I haven't said anything really about why she thinks that it's such a mistake to think that events have phenomenal properties, and moreover, it would therefore be a mistake to think that consciousness, or being phenomenally conscious, can be defined in terms of phenomenal properties. Well, why is that? Well, the problem isn't so much with the notion of an event. So for Nida-Rümelin, I think, an experience, as we've been saying, is an event. Well, what kind of event is it? It's an event that consists in the instantiation of experiential properties. So we know what experiential properties are. They're things like perceiving a red thing, feeling a pain in your foot. An event is just the instantiation of such a property. It's somebody's perceiving a red thing, let's say, or somebody's feeling a pain in your foot. In fact, this is very much like if we go back to Lewis, where he says, I will say experiences when I mean particular events of experiencing. These events are havings of experiential states. If we think of experiential states as like Nida-Rümelin's experiential properties, we could also say, I think, that events are instantiations of experiential properties, and that would bring those two views into line. So it isn't problematic to suppose that experiences are events. That isn't the issue. The issue is whether there are properties of events which can properly be called phenomenal properties. That's the issue. And this is, I think, where the Nida-Rümelin objection begins to take shape. The idea is, well, if there is such a thing as phenomenal properties and that they're instantiated, then they must be, first of all, properties of events, and be phenomenal. Well, what does phenomenal mean? Well, the idea is that somehow intuitively connected with experiences, or something of that kind. Connected somehow with phenomenal consciousness. But the idea is that, according to Nida-Rümelin, there's just no such property. There are certainly properties of these events, and there are certainly properties of, there are sort of properties in the vicinity that are kind of phenomenal, or at least wouldn't be in any way crazy to say that they're phenomenal. But there aren't properties that are both. There aren't properties that are both properties of events and also phenomenal. So a phenomenal property would have to be a property of an event which was phenomenal, but the thought is there just aren't such properties. There are properties of events, all right, and there are phenomenal properties, perhaps, but there aren't both. Well, why not? Well, what could these properties be? Well, what properties are involved in an event consisting in the instantiation of an experiential property, like S's perceiving a red thing, let's say? What properties are involved in S's perceiving a red thing? Well, one property that's involved is perceiving a red thing. That's a property. And in fact, that's what Nida-Rümelin calls an experiential property. But that property, notice, is not a property of an event. The property of perceiving a red thing is not a property of the event that consists of S's perceiving a red thing. It's not a property of an event. It's a property of a person, a subject. So that's not a phenomenal property. You might, if you like, call that a phenomenal property. It wouldn't be crazy. I mean, Martine Nida-Rümelin herself calls it an experiential property, and you could easily have called it a phenomenal property too. But the point is, it's not a property of an event. So that can't be the relevant property. Or take the property of being red. It's not crazy to think that somehow or other when you perceive a red thing, that bears some constitutive connection to the property of being red. So perhaps, for example, a perceiving of a red thing involves representing something as red, or perhaps being in a state that would be accurate if and only if you were seeing something red, something that had the property of being red. So it's not crazy to think that the property of being red is somehow involved in the event of somebody's perceiving a red thing. And you could even say that that's phenomenal as well. There is a kind of use according to which that might be a phenomenal property. But once again, that's not the property of the event. The event itself doesn't have the property of being red. That would mean that the event is red, which is a complete confusion. So it's not that property isn't a property of the event either. Now, that isn't to say that that events don't have properties. As I mentioned, birthday parties are events, and they have certain properties, like, lasting the whole afternoon. That's a property. So it's possible that events have properties, and this particular event has properties too, but none of them seem in any way intuitively phenomenal properties. Like you could take the property of being an event being an event consisting of the instantiation of the experiential property of perceiving a red thing. The event has that property. But that's a pretty highfalutin property. And moreover, it doesn't seem in any way to be a phenomenal property particularly. It's just a property that tells you that the event is the event that it is. And of course, there are other logical properties too, like being self-identical and so forth, that the event has that property. But that can't be a phenomenal property either. So the general idea of a phenomenal property is that there's just something that is intuitively phenomenal, which is a property of an event. And Nida-Rümelin's point is that there's just no such property. When you think about the properties in the vicinity, there might be some properties which you could call phenomenal intuitively, but they're not properties of this event. And the properties that are properties of the event don't seem to be phenomenal. So it's just a sort of confusion to think that there are phenomenal properties here that are instantiated, because while there are properties of events, they're not phenomenal, and while there are phenomenal properties, they are not properties of events, at least not of this sort. So how might an illusionist respond to this problem? Well, one way they might respond is to appeal to what we called last time aided introspection, introspection that's aided by background theory. So you could, for example, assume that you know by introspection that you instantiate some experiential property in the sense that Nida-Rümelin has in mind. So you know by introspection that you perceive a red thing, let's say. Well, then you might believe, as a matter of theory, you might believe that perceiving a red thing just is to have an experience that instantiates a phenomenal property. And hence you might believe, by aided introspection, that you are having an experience that instantiates that phenomenal property. In a certain sense, Nida-Rümelin wouldn't object to that. She thinks that a lot of theorists hold views like this, that they do hold that when you perceive a red thing, you have an experience that instantiates a phenomenal property. So that might be the case. So you could come to know by introspection that you're perceiving a red thing, and then given your background theory, you might arrive at a belief that says that you have an experience that instantiates a phenomenal property. And if there are no phenomenal properties, then you might think that's a kind of illusionism. But the response to this is very much like the response that we gave to the analogous move in the previous lecture. This wouldn't be real illusionism. It would just be weak illusionism, namely that this would just be an example of somebody, for whatever reason, having a false belief about the states that they're in, the properties that they instantiate. And that can certainly happen, but that's not the kind of illusionism that Frankish and his friends want to advance. And moreover, it remains the case that the theoretical belief here is a complete confusion from Nida-Rümelin's point of view. The idea is that there just isn't a phenomenal property of this kind. So it would be ridiculous to believe that when you perceive a red thing, that is just to have an experience that instantiates this phenomenal property, because there's no such property. Now, there's an obvious move to be made here. And in fact, in Frankish's reply to Nida-Rümelin, he does make a version of this. And the obvious reply is to try to switch to experiential properties. So she doesn't think that there's anything wrong with experiential properties. We do, in fact, instantiate them. And we can come to know by introspection that we instantiate them. So in principle, one could just say, okay, so let's formulate illusionism in terms of experiential properties. Now, really what happens at this point in her paper is that there are two separate replies to this. The second of one is in some ways less surprising. The first one is that she defends an acquaintance view. And in fact, as I mentioned, Nida-Rümelin is perhaps one of the most articulate defenders of the acquaintance view in contemporary literature. So here's the way she puts it. To have an experiential property is to be aware of having it. This is the remarkable feature of experiential properties. In virtue of this remarkable feature of experiential properties, we are aware of having experiential properties in a way which is not representational, in a sense that allows for misrepresentation. So this is rather similar to the idea that we looked at last time. It's that if you have an experiential property, then last time we put it as if you're in a conscious state. An acquaintance view says you're in a conscious state if and only if you are acquainted with being in this state. And that would say that you can't be acquainted with being in the state without being in the state. So acquaintance is always going to tell you the truth about the conscious state. And likewise, if you're in the conscious state, you must be acquainted with it. This doesn't quite tell you that you can't have a false belief about it, but the idea is that acquaintance somehow gives you this sort of basic form of awareness of being in the state. In fact, in Nida-Rümelin's version, acquaintance is even stronger than the version I talked about. She thinks that having it, the way she puts it here, is to have an experiential property is to be aware of having it. Now, I think I won't go into that here. That's a sort of complicated version of an acquaintance view that in fact identifies these things And you've got to ask yourself what, how this identity would in fact work. To have an experiential property is to be aware of having it. One thing that would follow from that is being aware of having it would itself be having an experiential property, which suggests another level of awareness and so forth. So in other words, we're off on a regress, which is a sort of standard problem for acquaintance theories. I'm not going to go into that here, but that's the sort of view which one could advance. I don't think actually this view would be terribly dialectically effective against an illusionist, because the illusionist will say, well, even if it's true that as a matter of definition, to have an experiential property is to be aware of having it, that still leaves open the idea that you could have a false introspective belief that you have experiential properties. And as we saw, that seems to be available. That seems to be completely consistent with the acquaintance view. So I won't say anything more about that acquaintance view, just to note that that's one of the responses she gives to this idea that you can switch to experiential properties and defend illusionism. I think, in fact, the main objection that she gives at this point, the main response, is to defend what Chalmers, in his own discussion of illusionism, calls the Moorean argument. She doesn't call it a Moorean argument, but it's very much a similar kind of argument. Here's what she says: I announced an argument for the claim that illusionism is not possibly true. To be more precise, one must say that the result obtained is a conditional one. If anyone has ever one of the experiential properties, then illusionism is false. We thus can exclude that illusionism is true if we accept a very weak assumption. Some people sometimes feel pain, are happy, sad, or enjoy the smell of basil, etc. In fact, it suffices to concede that there is at least one such property which is sometimes instantiated. It's crazy to deny this. Therefore, illusionism is an absurd view. So notice that she has the conditional: if anyone has ever one of the experiential properties, then illusionism is false. And she has the antecedent of that conditional, which she thinks of as a very weak assumption, namely, some people sometimes feel pain. That means, as she says, it suffices to concede that there is at least one such property. That is, people sometimes feel pain, and therefore, if people sometimes feel pain, then illusionism is false. And this, I think, is the main objection. So if we go back to the version I mentioned above, where the basic problem is that illusionism, according to illusionism, there's a property F such that it satisfies these three conditions. And we can think of Nida-Rümelin's objection as saying, well, F is either an experiential property or a phenomenal property. Experiential properties are properties of subjects. Phenomenal properties are properties of events. Well, if it's an experiential property, then B is false. F is not instantiated. That would be to say that people are not happy, do not smell basil, do not perceive red things, and so forth. And that, she thinks, is absurd. It's not absurd to say, perhaps, that phenomenal properties are not instantiated, but it would be mistaken to think that we believe by introspection that those properties are instantiated. That would be to interpret us in a quite mistaken way in the light of this confusion. Well, let me just finish then by mentioning something about this Moorean argument that both Nida-Rümelin and Chalmers are interested in. And here's a way to think of the argument. Premise 1, I perceive a red thing. Premise 2, if I perceive a red thing, then illusionism is false. Conclusion, illusionism is false. I think that's very much the argument that Nida-Rümelin is giving in this passage. The result obtained is a conditional one. If anyone has ever one of the experiential properties, then illusionism is false. But of course, somebody does have one of those experiential properties. That's just to say that, for example, they perceive a red thing. Now, the idea that this is a Moorean argument, which is what Chalmers describes it, is the idea that it's analogous to this notorious argument for the external world. You remember that Moore tries to refute the skeptic or prove the existence of the external world by saying, here is a hand. First premise. Second premise, if there is a hand, then the external world exists. Therefore, the external world exists. Now, there's no question about the validity of these arguments. It seems to be true that if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. And it's also usually accepted that the second premise of the second conditional premise is true. So here the idea is that if I do in fact perceive a red thing, then illusionism is false. That seems to be true just by the definition of illusionism, which entails, among other things, that it's not true that I perceive a red thing, especially if perceiving a red thing is a matter of instantiating an experiential property, which is what the assumption is here. And likewise, actually, in the Moorean case, if you've got an argument that says, if this is a hand, then the external world exists, it's hard to see how that can be false. So everything then comes down to the first premise, and the issue isn't so much whether the premise is true, but whether the argument begs the question. It's often thought that Moore, for example, is somehow begging the question against the skeptic, because he is asserting that this is a hand, but he wouldn't be permitted to assert that in the context. And so we can ask the same sort of question here. Is this argument a question-begging argument? And some illusionists have certainly said that it is. There was an interesting paper given by Francois Camara at ANU last year, actually, where he argued that this sort of argument begged the question. But I wanted just to end by pointing out that there's, in fact, a very strong sense in which it doesn't beg the question. And the sense in which it doesn't beg the question is something that picks up on a theme that we considered in lecture 3, in fact, about transparency. And so what would it be? Let's think about this argument again. If I perceive a red thing, premise 1, premise 2, if I perceive a red thing, illusionism is false. Conclusion, illusionism is false. Can we use this reasoning to establish that illusionism is false? Well, the idea of question-beggingness is the idea that somehow or other in the first premise I've assumed the conclusion, or at least in my reasoning in support of the first premise, I've assumed the conclusion. That would be a kind of way of characterizing what question-beggingness consists in. So somehow or other, in thinking that, in my support for the first premise, in my support for thinking that I perceive a red thing, I've assumed that illusionism is false. That would be part of my reason for thinking that the premise is true. And if that were the case, then I certainly would have begged the question against illusionism. But notice that we could say independently that I perceive a red thing can be known by introspection, which means I can know it, as we saw in the discussion of the transparency argument, I can know it without having evidence. I can know it just because I engage in a certain sort of introspection. And that's the reason that I can know it. And if I can know it without having any sort of evidence, then it seems to be the case that I can know it without having any evidence, such as the claim that the conclusion is true. So it isn't the case that when I endorse the first premise of the argument, I rely on the fact that the conclusion is true. All that's true is that I rely on the fact that I've engaged in a certain kind of introspection, which I can do independently of the third premise. I think that's true also in the Moorean argument, incidentally. If one says that the Moorean argument begs the question, that would be to say that you've somehow used the fact that the external world exists in support of the claim that this is a hand. But I don't think that's what the Moorean thinks. I think the Moorean thinks that we can just tell by perception that this is a hand. And from that we can infer that the external world exists. And if you can tell by perception that this is a hand, then you don't rely on any evidence in any way. You don't rely on some proposition that supports the claim that this is a hand, like the proposition that the external world exists. And likewise here, if I say that I perceive a hand, or if I have evidence, if I support that premise, it's not the case that I have evidence for that premise in the sense that I'm aware of some proposition like that illusionism is false, which supports that premise. It's rather that I simply do it by introspection. It's not evidential in the relevant way. So I think that the idea that we can know things by introspection and therefore know things not on the basis of evidence has an important impact on the assessment of this Moorean argument. Okay, so let me then sum up. In fact, I can sum up our lectures in general. So let's go back. In lecture 1 and 2, what I did is I set out what introspection is, and I introduced various theories of introspection. And I then set aside in lecture 2, following Shoemaker's discussion, various inner sense or perceptual theories. So at that point we thought, okay, we've got acquaintance theories perhaps, and we've got inferential theories, and we've got rationalist theories, but we should set aside inner sense or perceptual theories. And then in lectures 3 and 4, we had a look at transparency issues, or what's usually called transparency arguments or evidence arguments, mainly from Dretske and Evans. And we saw that a kind of rationalist view about introspection provides a good answer to these arguments, and in fact provides a better answer than inferentialist proposals, which are of the kind that we find in let's say, Alex Byrne. There are other inferentialist proposals as well that involve inferences from other things known by introspection, but those theories obviously can't be full theories of introspection. We also noted that things like Shoemaker's constitutivist view doesn't seem very plausible, at least if we clarify what the notion of rationality is that's at issue here. So it's better to hold a rationalist view that builds consciousness into the content of rationality in a way that Shoemaker doesn't. And then in lectures 5 and 6, we kind of took what, in a certain sense, was a bit of a detour, but I think we needed to take that detour in order to assess illusionism at the end. And that was about revelation. And the question there was, is it true or isn't it true that we can come to know in introspection not only that we're in conscious states, but what the essence of those states are? And I was pretty skeptical about that. I know it's commonly said that either it's true or it's presupposed in philosophy of mind or something, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical about that. And that's partly because if that thesis of revelation were true, then we would come to know the essence of our states, but not on the basis of no evidence at all, which seems like a crazy kind of claim. And then in the last 2 lectures, Introspection and Illusion, we looked at various possibilities of ignorance and error, and various ways in which introspection, considered as a representational system, might be subject to certain sort of limitations. We also looked at the anti-luminosity argument and how to respond to it. And then in this lecture, in the very last part of the previous lecture, we looked at illusionism. And I guess I've come down on the side of the Moorean argument against illusionism, following Nida-Rümelin and Chalmers and a few others. And what's interesting is that one can advance this argument without its begging the question, because that would be a matter of it's not the case that we presuppose the conclusion in supporting the premise. All that's true is that we come to know the premise on the basis of some non-evidential route, which is exactly what introspection provides us with. And there's many more things to say about introspection, but we're not going to say them today, so I'm going to bring this to an end. So thanks so much for your attention. It's been great talking through these things. Thanks a lot. And there's my email. Don't hesitate to email me if you'd like to. Talk to you later. Bye.